Hello, Declarative Amsterdam. I'm Maggie, and I'm going to be giving a talk today called Tools for Thought as Cultural Systems, Not Computational Objects. But first, I want to give you a little bit of light context about me. I am primarily a designer, although I originally studied cultural anthropology, and I would call myself a mediocre developer, meaning I do it as and when needed, but I would never boast about my programming skills. I'm currently a product designer at an AI research lab called ORT. We are working on building critical thinking and open-ended reasoning tools, primarily with large language models. I'm also a big enthusiast for visual programming, end-user development, and really good metaphors, which I'm sure as programmers you all appreciate good metaphors and good abstractions. So the topic of my talk today is tools for thought. And I'm not going to assume everybody knows what that phrase means or the history behind it, so don't worry, I will explain all of that. So, tools for thought is a few things. It is first and foremost a philosophical dream with a very long history about what happens when you give humans really well-designed tools that expand the kinds of thoughts they're able to think. Second, in recent years, it's become a gathering point for a whole set of complementary communities. It's really great when names can unify a whole set of disparate fields, and Tools for Thought has so far done this quite well. So it combines the field of personal knowledge management. Some people might think of this as note-taking, but essentially just managing all your personal knowledge. It also involves the fields of interaction design and computer-human interaction. It also involves the field of computer-supported collaborative work, which is an academic field focused on how we use computers to collaborate together. And finally, I'd include people who are interested in knowledge graphs, graph databases, and I would include structured data in this as well. And finally, most interestingly, it's now become a bit of a category of software and what I would call computational objects. So software-like things, including hardware. There's been a whole bunch of startups come up that use this phrase, tools for thought, in their marketing and on their landing pages. So for example, this is Muse, which is a spatial note-taking app for iPad, and they call it a tool for thought. This is AnyType, which is a structured data-based note-taking app, which has a little bit of cooperation in terms of decentralization involved. Again, using tools for thought. This is Cosmic, which is a visual tool for thought. It's a spatial canvas with quite a strong backend. And this is Rome Research, which popularized the term a fair bit. They were focused on networked thought, so they had a big focus on bidirectional linking and transclusions. There are also tools that don't use the phrase directly, but allude to the same things. So this is the phrase think better appears on quite a few of them. This is Reflect, which is another note-taking app. Again, think better. This is on Clovo, which is another note-taking app. You'll start to notice a theme here. So there's been this huge deluge of new note-taking and knowledge management systems aligning themselves with this concept of tools for thought. And all of these tools have come out in maybe the last 5 years, the majority in the last 2 years. So this is a kind of new interest in this phrase and an assumption about what it means to build tools for thought. There are also meetup groups organizing around it. So this is a Tools for Thought event that runs every month that has hosted speakers. If you go onto YouTube and search for Tools for Thought, there's an enormous number of thought leaders and content makers making lots and lots of guides for how to use each of these tools and different techniques for ways to use them. And there's now an accelerator at BetaWorks in New York funding companies under the concept of tools for thought. I've also heard of VC funds using tools for thought as a category or tab in their giant Airtable databases of companies. So it's clearly starting to gather a little bit of interest. So I think it's worth paying attention to tools for thought because it's becoming an idea machine. An idea machine is a concept from Nadia Asperhoover. She has a really wonderful article. You can Google search to find it. And she calls an idea machine an ideology that's backed up by people, companies, software, and most importantly, money, right? It's ideas that get capital deployed behind them to be able to build bigger things together. Some really good examples of this are effective altruism. They've been a very effective idea machine. Web3 was also a very effective idea machine. It's a really great ideology that gets people to put power behind it. So Tools for Thought is slowly inching towards becoming an idea machine. So there's this big question that this talk is going to be asking, and I want to consider what it might look like if we think of tools for thought as sets of cultural practices rather than computational objects. So I'm coming at this very much from a cultural anthropology and a design perspective, and I'm very much a part of the community of people who are building and using this kind of software. So I feel obliged to critically interrogate it a bit. And the community has grown enough that we already have a lot of assumptions about what it means to work on tools for thought and the mission of the tools for thought. So I'm really interested in kind of prodding what it might look like if we think about this phrase differently and how it might direct us down very different paths about what we might choose to work on. So one of the first critical questions we should ask is, what does tools for thought have to do with computers, right? The phrase itself, at face value, implies nothing about computation or digital objects. It simply means tools that help humans think new kinds of thoughts. So if we try to come up with examples of tools for thought throughout history, I'd conclude that the vast majority of them precede computing by thousands of years. So think about written language, right? It's an enormous tool for thought. It's enabled all kinds of new ways of thinking. Hindu-Arabic numerals obviously enabled mathematics. Songs and poetry to record oral history have been an enormous tool for thought to allow history to be passed along through generations before written language. Data visualization allows us to see data in very different kinds of ways. Cartesian coordinates, arguably. Spreadsheets, I think, are a huge tool for thought. The Socratic method, maps, I could go on. This could be a very long list. But the point is that the vast majority of these are very pre-computational and yet still have a profound effect on the kinds of thoughts we're able to think now. So to explore just a few of these in specific, we can look at Hindu-Arabic numerals. They made accounting and record keeping possible. They kind of enabled all of bureaucracy since. Epic poetry as oral history has been a huge technique that has allowed memorization and knowledge transfer across generations, right? It gave us historical records before written language. And it's the reason we can have things like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Mahabharata surviving till today without needing to be written down for a long period of time. Maps have been a huge one. They have enabled what's called an allocentric view, meaning like a bird's eye view of space. Once people are able to map things as if from above, it enables them to think differently about the space they're moving within. They're able to construct mental maps of larger spaces. It really just gives us the ability to see in the way that we couldn't before. And there was a time before maps existed. So the very first map we ever found is from 200 BCE. It's a Babylonian map of a city. And this shifted the way humans are able to understand space. I think Cartesian coordinates are a really interesting example. So of course, this was famously developed by René Descartes by watching a fly circle around his room and began to think about what if that point in space had numbers. And it allows us to model objects that don't exist very accurately. It allows us to very precisely map and refer to points on Earth, right? It led to GPS. It profoundly changed the way we're able to think about space. So it's a huge tool for thought. Data visualization is quite recent. This 1785 was the very first one, when William Playfair made this graph here of the Bank of England's balance over time. And data visualizations allow us to concisely compare and contrast and see patterns in large amounts of data. So these are all unquestionably tools for thought that have changed the kinds of thoughts that people are capable of having. But this is primarily a list of cultural practices, right? These are techniques, they are ways of doing things, and they have been passed down through the generations and enabled us and everyone in the future to think these new kinds of thoughts continuously. So they're not computational objects, right? The things that were invented were not the compass, they were not the pencil, right? They were Cartesian coordinates and writing. So they're mediums and techniques that give us new ways to relate to information and representation. So I think most interestingly is all the things that people are enamored with the current software movement are actually these practices as well. These are a few more that are very, very popular in the current space. There's something called Zettelkasten, which is a certain technique for making notes that are deeply interlinked, that a lot of people are practicing in these new software apps that are named tools for thought. A lot of people are exploring space repetition, which uses apps like Anki. RemNote is another, where people are practicing what happens if you're prompted a specific thing over time. It allows you to remember it better. Memory palaces are another one, so that's about spatial memory, that the vast majority of our user interfaces use something akin to spatial memory or memory palaces to help us remember where things are. So all of these things are popular right now, but they are all pre-digital tools for thought, right? None of these inherently require a computer. The computational implementations of these help, but they are not the thing itself. So just to show here that huge deluge of YouTube videos that exist around tools for thought, here's a few examples of them, that even when they're referencing talking about specific apps like Obsidian or Logseq or Notion, they are also focused on these practices. So it's how to do Zettelkasten in whatever software. Similar for spaced repetition, there's a lot of videos that are how to do spaced repetition in app. So we can't quite tell if it's the app that's enabling people to improve their memory or the practice. So we're in sort of an interesting place where all these pieces of software and apps are being called tools for thought in themselves. And most of the community is focused on building more software like this. But it seems to me like these cultural practices are the real tools for thought. So what we're exploring here is the relationship between the computer as a medium and the cultural practices we do within that medium, and which one of those we should be focusing on within this community. So we're still on this question, right? Like, what does any of this have to do with computers? And it might sound like a bit of a dumb rhetorical question, but I think it's worth answering earnestly, because it's going to help us understand why we're confused about this phrase. So I think we should go back to the origins of where this phrase came from and who proposed we should start paying attention to the idea. So tools for thought as a philosophical dream about the potential of humans and well-designed tools that help them think. So this phrase, tools for thought, is very historically rooted in computer science and HCI, human-computer interaction, right? Words do not just get taken at face value. There is always a cultural meaning that they are embedded within. So we should pay attention to who came up with it. And all the major advocates of tools for thought throughout history have been programmers. So the very first person to use the phrase was Kenneth Iverson. He wrote throughout the 1950s and 60s about notation as a tool for thought. He was specifically talking about programming and mathematical notation. His first paper on it was published in 1980, but he was writing about it before then. This is an excerpt from his 1980 paper, where he says, mathematical notation provides perhaps the best known and well-developed example of language used as a tool for thought. So again, very, very focused on programming here and maths as kind of a medium for tool for thought, as a tool for thought. Around the same time period in the 1950s and 60s, Douglas Engelbart, who's obviously a very famous programmer, wrote a very long piece called Augmenting the Human Intellect, where he essentially talked about the same kinds of ideas that Iverson was exploring, but he just used slightly different language. He talked about augmenting intellect quite a lot. And his thesis was that computers should be able to help us approach a complex problem situation to gain comprehension to suit our particular needs and to derive solutions to problems. So he had this really big vision about how computers had this really special place in being able to expand the capacities of humans. Alan Kay picked up on a lot of this philosophy and applied it while developing the foundations of our current computing environments. So hopefully everyone knows Alan Kay was one of the primary researchers of Xerox PARC, developed the desktop metaphor, Xerox Alto, like very fundamental, profound things that we all rely on today to do computing. And he wrote this paper called User Interface, A Personal View in 1989, where he talked about his vision of the computational medium as a tool for thought. And it's kind of summed up in this quote where he believes that if we had a real computational tool for thought, the very use of it would change the thought patterns of an entire civilization. A lot of this history and these stories are all summarized in this book, Tools for Thought, which Howard Rheingold wrote in 1985. A lot of it is about the birth of personal computers and goes through the histories of many of the people I mentioned, as well as many others, talking about how we got to our current state of computing. So there was a lot of activity around Tools for Thought in the 50s, 60s, up into the 80s. Tools for Thought went a little bit quiet in the 1990s, not a lot was written. But there's now been a new resurgence of this. Starting around 2013, Brett Victor, who's an interface designer, started doing talks, which kind of brought a new generation back into this Tools for Thought canon. So he did this series, including the humane representation of thought and media for thinking the unthinkable, that brings back this idea that computers were always meant to be a very profound medium for thinking, and our current state of computing currently doesn't achieve that. In 2019, Andy Matuszczak and Michael Nielsen wrote a very long, comprehensive essay on the history of Tools for Thought, which gave it even more renewed interest. So more and more people started to use this phrase, to gather around this phrase, to consider what it would mean to start trying to build more tools for thought. And in that essay, they say that a tool for thought would be a context where the user can have new kinds of thoughts that were formerly impossible to them. which I think sums up quite well everyone's current understanding of the phrase. So first, I think we should make a few things clear. In all the examples that I just showed, they are talking about a medium for thought more than a tool. And these two, I think it's easy to get confused about them, and I'm not sure that policing the division is actually that helpful. But for philosophical clarity, I think we should define them a little bit. So I would say mediums are a material that we would use to communicate, explore and communicate ideas, right? So we're thinking about things that have a certain collection of affordances and particular constraints. So thinking about film or painting or programming, right? They are a medium through which we express ideas. And a tool is much more of an efficient enabler of a very specific task or a very specific workflow. So here you could think about, a hammer, a compass, even tools that are not physical, like the Socratic method or agile, that is a tool, right? It's a very specific thing that enables a certain workflow. So again, the line between these, I don't know is that important, but just so that we have a little bit of a clearer understanding, there's some definitions. So looking at the history of that, I think it's much more accurate to say that these thinkers are referring to a computational medium for thought, where the focus is on the computerness and the mediumness. Those are very critical elements. So I kind of wanted to propose that we call it computational mediums for thought rather than tools for thought, but that is definitely less catchy, and I can admit that alliteration is a really important component of having a catchy community title that you can get passed around. So I would maybe draw it a little bit like this, that if we say tools for thought is this really large category that can include both tools and mediums that expand the range of human thought. And so far, this community is specifically talking about computational mediums for thought, which is a subsection of a larger tools for thought vision. So I think we should ask, what's so special about computers? Why are all these people so focused on computers as the future of tools for thought versus any other medium or material that we might have available to us? Are computers especially well suited to this? So I think this is best answered by this Alan Kay quote, which comes from that same paper I referenced earlier, where Alan says that computers can dynamically simulate the details of any other medium, including media that cannot exist physically. It is not a tool, although it can act like many tools. It is the first meta-medium. I think this speaks well to the affordances of computers, that we've realized that they really are this exceptionally powerful medium that is slightly different to any other medium that we've encountered before, and that they can mimic other mediums. So yeah, we have to acknowledge there's something special about computing. It can create representations of the world that we can explore and manipulate, and we are freed from many of the constraints of physical materials. And when we encode these existing cultural practices into this computational medium or computational tools, it reconfigures them and expands them and it transforms them. It makes them very different to what they were before, right? This meta medium changes what the practice is. If we think about the example of the Zettelkasten, which was that note-taking system that I referenced earlier, I think we have to admit that it would be absurd to say that a digital Zettelkasten has the exact same affordances as a physical one. So a physical one used to be made of all these paper cards that were kept in this huge cabinet, and you would write which card was connected to which one with just little numbers that connected them on the paper. But in a digital version, right, we have things like bidirectional linking, where notes can immediately reference one another. We have full text search, which you absolutely cannot do in a physical medium. We can have dynamic views of data if we structure it well. We have copy and paste. We can back things up in case of fire. The computational version really does change and expand our capacity in some way. And I think we can admit that it also limits it in others, right? There are certainly many embodied and physical limitations to doing things all on screens. But what we get in the digital version really does change what the practice is. But even though computing expands some of these practices in new ways, we shouldn't forget that we're still recreating cultural practices that first existed outside of computing. Right? The computer amplifies or enables the practice, but it is not the practice itself. And at the moment, there is still a lot of staring hard at the computer directly, thinking about what the computer can do, thinking about software and thinking about interfaces and thinking about novel ways to store and retrieve data. And all of that is certainly necessary to some extent, right? You do need to understand the medium you're working within. But at the moment, there's still not a lot of attention being put on the cultural practices we're trying to represent. There's still not a lot of research being done on the cultural practices themselves. There's this obsession with the medium, which happens in lots of disciplines. I mean, there's certainly a joke in here about how people who really want to do creative writing end up just writing about creative writing rather than doing creative writing about things that are not creative writing. And I think we're stuck on a little bit of that loop in tools for thought around computation at the moment. So how might we go about the process of focusing more on the cultural practices that are the real tools for thought rather than just the apps and software that enable them? I think one really promising place to look is at the practices that users themselves bring to these tools and want to do in them. So here's an example from Roam Research, which is a fairly popular note-taking tool. And at some point, they enabled community plugins. And someone built one called Smart Blocks, which gave end users, people who didn't know JavaScript, a simplified syntax to store and retrieve variables and to write very basic logic, sort of, if this, then that statements. And what happened was people built a huge range of scripts in this language that kind of displayed the types of practices they were already doing in Roam. So someone built an interstitial journaling script where it would ask them to reflect on what they were thinking about and then show them their reflections over the course of the past week. Other people built decision-making scripts, so if they were stuck not understanding what kind of decision to make, it would ask them a series of questions for pros and cons and then ask them to weight those pros and cons. Other people built Pomodoro timers, that classic 25 to 5-minute workflow tracker. And all of these things showed that if you give people the right primitive tools, they can really design their own cultural practices or bring their own from outside into the tool. So it means that the designers and developers of the tool itself don't have to kind of enforce their idea of what the cultural practice should be on their users. Some people might be familiar with this phrase, end user programming, which is really what I'm talking about here when I talk about simplified primitives like Roam Smart Blocks gave people. End user programming is the dream that we would be able to design systems that enable non-programmers to write very simple programs. And this is really important because it means that programmers and designers don't have as much power. It means that we have to hand over the idea of what the ideal workflow through an application is to the users themselves. And then people are going to be able to build their own tools with these sorts of primitives. There's a lot of difficulties to this dream, but it's really worth pursuing, especially when we talk about tools for thought and taking that quite seriously. It does mean giving people the power to build their own systems for cultural practices rather than enforcing our own on them. And we're now entering an age with language models where we can kind of take this a step further. I recently wrote a piece called Programmable Notes that talks about what it might look like to have agent-based note-taking systems that can kind of prompt and facilitate these custom workflows. So here's an example of a flow that I would love to have in my own system, where when I'm writing an essay and I have a kind of draft and I've marked it as complete, what I would love is to have a collaborative partner there who could ask me all the kinds of questions that my old favorite writing professor might ask. Things like, do you actually have a point and have you successfully made it? Or, is this littered with passive voice? Even just that kind of technical fixing would be really helpful. Another one that would be great is if when I say I'm stuck for new ideas, it could maybe select a few random notes from my database and ask me to expand upon them with some sort of structured method, something like Scamper or oblique strategies or something from lateral thinking. That'd be really helpful. And we're getting to the stage where we really can do this with new programmatic tools. Because the thing is that most software in the current tools for thought space actually enables only a very narrow range of activities. We're primarily helping people capture information, right? So that's note-taking apps that allow you to quickly type something in. It allows people to organize information, right? We can link, we can tag, we can put things in folders, we can categorize them. We can retrieve information. This is essentially search, right? And maybe bidirectional linking, being able to have the right relevant information appear when you need it. It helps us remember information. That's things like the spaced repetition systems or simply having a huge database you can call upon anytime. What we're not great at, things that we're just like starting to get good at, is searching for new information. So this is like Google search. Synthesizing ideas, again, we're not quite there, but we're starting to figure out systems that can help us bring different ideas together and help us understand how they coalesce or how they might contradict one another. And generating ideas is another one that's not our strong suit, but having systems that prompt us, that challenge us, that ask us questions, that force us to think about new information, we're just starting to figure out how those systems might work. And these are all great, but they're also also sort of serve a very particular flavor of text-based knowledge work, right? This is like people who have the need to put research input and output into a program and have a very textual focus. These are people who are like academics, social scientists, strategists, journalists, consultants, VCs, and programmers, right? The kinds of systems that we currently have are designed for the people who build the systems, and this isn't surprising. And this is in contrast to systems that we don't have, let's say, are systems that are heavily embodied, that are visual, that are mathematical, that deal with oral expertise. Our current tools for thought are not as useful for accountants, molecular biologists, visual artists, musicians, dancers, architects. Of course, we do have software that serves some of these disciplines really well, right? Spreadsheets for mathematics, or 3D modeling for biologists, or Logic Pro for musicians. But it's strange that these aren't really part of the conversation of the tools for thought community. These are considered somehow outside of it or not necessarily relevant. At the moment, we have a very limited definition of what we think tools for thought is. So I think in general, we should be paying attention to this wider range of disciplines and areas of expertise. Here's an example of Jacob Collier, is a very, very famous Grammy award-winning musician who does these live streams showing how he uses Logic Pro on YouTube. And they're over an hour long, but they're this really exceptional example of how a computational medium can enable wildly different kinds of musical thought. Here you can see he's layering his voice hundreds of times and using special effects to integrate them. So this is a really, really good example of a tool for thought that isn't necessarily about text-based note-taking, essentially. Here's another example of these are generated images from Midjourney, which is one of the new image gen platforms that's obviously become very, very popular in the last 6 months. This is a completely different kind of expanding our thought and brainstorming and exploring possibilities in a space that isn't text-based and is a little more fuzzy than, let's say, synthesizing notes, but is also a really, really important avenue for the tools for thought community to consider and explore how this ties into expanding thought. Because at the moment, it feels like we're not really exploring computational mediums for thought as much as we're exploring a very small subset that I'm calling computational mediums for white-collar knowledge work, or CMFWKW for convenience. It's not as catchy, but it's getting there. But the point is that it's clear we need to expand our view of this field a little bit. And so I have 3 ideas about ways that we might diversify the tools for thought community. The first is bringing more user research and participant observation into the tools for thought space. This means spending extensive time with people, observing their cultural practices outside of computing and outside of using devices. What are people actually doing in the real world? Obviously, this has a long lineage in software design and programming, just getting more user research done, but this is really important specifically for the tools for thought space. The second is to invest more time in tools that allow people to encode their own practices. So this is what I talked about with the end user programming piece. We just need to enable people to solve their own problems and not try to solve them for them. And third is to draw on the long history of cognitive science, because there's this entire other discipline that has been thinking about how humans think and how humans relate to their environment. Some of this is a little bit of psychology, but I think I put more weight into cognitive science, has been doing a lot of work on this. And they've been researching, all the other methods like the Socratic method and spatial memory and embodied cognition that help us understand how humans think and understand the world. Taking this holistic view and bringing in other disciplines will only make the tools for thought software space more grounded in, I think, the reality of how humans think. That's the end. I want to thank you very much for listening and for entertaining my slightly offbeat topic. I would love questions, thoughts, opinions. This is a very new space and no one is necessarily the owner of the narrative or the ideology here. I'm very interested in what other people believe tools for thought is and should be. Thank you very much.